Deception, lying and murder. Are they ever okay? How about in wartime? That's the question we'll look at this time on The Sci-Fi Show. One of my favourite Star Trek Deep Space Nine episodes is from Season 6. The episode, In the Pale Moon Light, consists of Commander Sisko dictating a log entry about events that have recently transpired. The Federation is locked in a losing war with the Dominion and defeat seems inevitable. He hatches a plan with Elam Garak, the station's Cardassian tailor and former member of the Cardassian Secret Police, the Obsidian Order, to bring the Romulan Star Empire into the war on the side of the Federation. By the end of the episode, Commander Sisko has lied to and been an accessory to the assassination of a Romulan senator and managed to get the Romulans into the war on the side of the Federation. Was his course of action morally permissible? This is the question he wrestles with throughout the episode, and ultimately he concludes that he can probably live with himself because what he did was necessary. It's worth remembering that Commander Sisko's situation is a difficult one. He's on the side losing a war, and the price of losing the war is the enslavement of the Alpha Quadrant at the hands of the Dominion. I suppose it's worth asking whether life under the Dominion is all that bad, although given the brutal nature of the Jem'Hadar, it seems that the rule of the Founders is less benevolent than we might wish for. Historically, deception has been a part of war. You always seek to deceive an opponent in an effort to gain a tactical or strategic advantage to aid in victory. Although this deception is different, here a third party is being lied into the war through deliberately manufactured intelligence. Now in reality, although the intelligence itself was manufactured, the content of the intelligence was likely to be true on some level. The argument that the Dominion's perfect order would never tolerate the Romulans' messy little empire next door is undoubtedly true. So what ethical frameworks can shed light on the hard decision that Commander Sisko had to make? Ethical philosophy is another of those enormous topics that has roots going back to the very beginning of philosophy itself, and one we'll revisit, but there are three broad ethical frameworks that have existed when it comes to normative ethics. Normative ethics is the branch of ethical reasoning that involves how one should act in a given situation. These are virtue ethics, deontological ethics, and consequentialist ethics. Each of these schools of thought have many subdivisions, and there are other ways ethical theories can be divided up, but they do provide a useful framework in which to consider ethics and perhaps shed light on what Commander Sisko should have done. Before we take a look at each theory though, let's consider what is the central dilemma for Commander Sisko. Does he lie the Romulans into the war? A necessary war that will ultimately protect both the Federation and the Romulan Star Empire, or not? Lying's a tricky topic because it raises the question of what is considered a lie, or at least what is a lie that it is impermissible to tell. Lying itself is a surprisingly complex topic. On the surface it's simple enough. A lie is a spoken untruth. But that's the first difficulty. Obviously if I think I'm telling the truth but am mistaken, then that's not a lie. And then there's the other case of something like flattery, where an untruth is spoken, but the other party is not really expected to believe the flattery. It's just a polite cultural convention. The Japanese have a cultural convention like this, and people are expected to show modesty in the face of such flattery, and to not do so is considered a serious social faux pas. So it would seem that lying requires an intention to deceive the person you are lying to into believing the untruth is actually true. There's also the additional consideration of why you intend to deceive the person, whether the lie is told for their benefit or for the liar's benefit. In Commander Sisko's case, it seems we have at least an approximation of the worst sort of lie. There's a definite intent to make Senator Vreenak believe an untruth, and it's an untruth that is told for the benefit of Commander Sisko, or at least for the benefit of the Federation. And anyway, it has the blessing of Starfleet intelligence, so they're complicit in the lie. The lies eventually lead to murder, to make it convincing, and to tie up loose ends, but that just compounds the wrongdoing to some degree. Lying the Romulans into the war without the assassination of Senator Vreenak and the disposal of Tolar would still seem to be essentially as bad an act. Maybe not quite as bad, but in the larger scheme of things, the death of a Romulan senator and his entourage, and the death of a condemned criminal, seem small next to the number of Romulans that would inevitably be killed in the conflict once it escalates. I suppose some consolation is that the Federation won the war. If they'd ultimately been defeated, then all the deaths would have been for nothing. So with that in mind, let's consider some ethical frameworks. I think it's probably best to discuss them in reverse order and start with consequentialist ethics, although historically the trend was in the other direction. Looking at it this way, you'll note that each ethical framework is a superset of the framework before it. In history, each new framework was a stripping down of the older one. In consequentialist ethics, you have a framework that determines the morality of an act by the results of that choice. There's no other particular consideration that goes into making an act moral. It's results-oriented. The most common consequentialist framework is that of the utilitarian, which seeks to determine the morality of an act by how much utility it provides, using some metric like aggregate happiness or aggregate pleasure. The early 17th century philosopher Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill advocated for a framework that sought to maximize pleasure, seeing that as the ultimate metric of value, and more modern proponents like Princeton's Peter Singer seem to look to minimizing of suffering as the metric of choice. These consequentialist frameworks, that are principally concerned with the results, are often criticized for the difficulty of working out the consequences of a choice, and will fall back on general moral rules that are known to generally have good consequences, as the rule of choice when making ethical decisions because of this difficulty. I don't think this is necessarily a problem for such a framework, although it does suggest that they may be incomplete. Perhaps the stripping down has gone too far. Next we have deontological ethics. Deontology is a word that derives from the ancient Greek word deon, which means duty, paired with the Greek word logos, meaning word, and in this context meaning study of. The basic idea in deontological frameworks is that you have a set of rules that are morally obligatory and you should adhere to those rules. The basis of these rules and how they can be derived is varied. One of the well-known proponents of a deontological framework is Immanuel Kant, who proposed the categorical imperative. There are two related principles that make up the categorical imperative. These are, act according to a maxim by which you will that it would become a universal law, and secondly, act in a way that treats yourself and other human beings as ends in themselves and not simply means to another end. You can see streaks of consequentialism in this, but it's greater than simply that. An example will clear these things up. Is it morally permissible to lie? Kant would have said no, because if lying was a universal ideal, then society would not be able to function, although telling the truth is a more workable principle. In terms of treating people as ends, the idea is simply that you don't treat people as objects to be used for your personal gain. You use a spade to dig holes because it's good for that, and you discard the spade when it no longer functions for the purpose of digging. It is valued instrumentally and discarded when it fails to perform. Kant thought it was wrong to treat people like this. There is another flavour of deontological ethics that is known as divine command theory, and it centres in the idea that something is good if God commands it, and something is bad if God forbids it. It was an ethical framework popular with the Calvinist reformers and medieval philosophers like William of Ockham. Yes, the Occam of Ockham's razor fame. I mentioned divine command theory because, although it is a deontological framework, like Kant's categorical imperative, they are really fundamentally different, even though they share the same broad label. At a glance, they actually look quite similar, a set of moral obligations that are binding on all men. But what makes them different, and radically so, is the source of the authority. In Kant's framework, the ultimate source of authority rests in man, but with divine command theory, the source of authority rests with a deity. Superficially they are similar, but fundamentally they are very different. Another thing worth noting about deontological frameworks is that they're often morally absolutist with frameworks that are binding on all people everywhere. This isn't necessarily true, but it is a common feature of such frameworks. Also note that the consequences of an action are important to the deontologist, but they are not the overriding concern. Keeping the rules is the overriding concern. One criticism of such an approach is that it works fine if everybody plays by the rules, but it can have a difficulty with how to act in the case where one party is breaking the rules. Classic thought experiment involves the German citizen hiding Jews from Nazis when the Gestapo knocks on the door. What is the right course of action? Is it permissible to lie to protect the Jews, or do you have an obligation to tell the truth, or at least to refuse to lie, even in such a case? Finally, we have virtue ethics. Virtue ethics is a class of ethical theory that centers on being virtuous and concerned with the character and soul of the agent who is making decisions. Soul doesn't need to be understood in a necessarily religious or substance dualist sense, just in the sense of your true self. But it does seem like the right word, so I'll use it. Virtue ethics is less concerned with a specific set of moral rules and more concerned with the character of the individual, reasoning that a virtuous person will be able to reason and act morally because they are virtuous. The tradition of virtue ethics-based approaches to normative ethics goes back at least to Plato and Aristotle. One important feature of virtue ethics is that it's inevitably teleological. Teleology comes from the Greek word telos, which means end or purpose. There is a proper and virtuous way to live, and living in such a way will make for an ethical life. The exact form of ethical structure built on virtue will depend on what is considered to be virtuous as opposed to vicious behaviour. So what's Ben Sisko to do? At least for the consequentialist framework, it seems that the choice is simple. Lie to Vreenak and murder him if you have to, because the greater good would be served by getting the Romulans into the war. Although this isn't necessarily the choice a consequentialist might make, reasoning that if the Romulans ever find out about the deception, the murder of one of their senators and tricking them into war against their ally, it's unlikely to be looked upon favourably. By comparison, the deontologist would likely consult the list of rules and conclude that such behaviour is possibly unacceptable because lying as a rule is not acceptable. Certainly assassinating Vreenak and his entourage would be out of the question, even if the lie could be countenanced. If the deontological framework had a hierarchy of rules, then perhaps the duty to shorten the war and save the lives or defeat tyranny would trump the rule about lying and perhaps even the one about assassination. Finally, for the virtue ethicist, the choice is a complex one. Does it make Ben Sisko a more virtuous person to behave in this way? I suspect ultimately the answer is no, so it would rule at least some of the actions out. Ethics, it would seem, is a tricky business. Commander Sisko is in an unenviable situation, fighting a losing war for survival against an implacable enemy and needing assistance if the Federation was to survive. What would you have done? You can find more information on the different ideas contained in this episode in the show notes on sci-fi-show.com. I can be reached with comments via thesci-fi-show@gmail.com. You can leave comments in the show notes at sci-fi-show.com, and you can also leave comments on the Facebook page, facebook.com/sci-fi-show. You can also follow the show via The Sci-Fi Show on Twitter. If there's a topic you would like me to look into, please don't hesitate to ask, and don't forget, it's Fire with a PH. Let me know what you think. The Sci-Fi Show is recorded under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike 3.0 license, and the music is provided by Furious J and Maniacal M.